A king vanished for 40 days. When he returned, he claimed he'd been inside the earth. Not underground in caves or tunnels, inside the earth itself, walking through halls lit by stones that never dimmed, breathing air that tasted like metal, meeting beings who spoke without moving their mouths. His name was Etana. He ruled the ancient city of Kish around 2800 BCE, and according to the Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents ever discovered, Etana didn't just rule his city. He ascended to heaven, descended into the underworld, and returned with knowledge that changed everything. But here's what makes this different from every other ancient myth you've heard. Etana left instructions, detailed descriptions of what he saw, how he got there, and what the beings inside the earth told him. Instructions so specific that some researchers believe they're not mythology at all. They're documentation. However, for over 4,000 years, these texts have been locked away in academic vaults, dismissed as religious fantasy, labeled as primitive creation stories. And the few scholars who dared to take them literally, their careers ended before their research could. If you're enjoying this deep dive into forbidden history, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed ancient texts and archaeological anomalies the mainstream won't touch every single week. Let's start with what we actually know. The Sumerian king list is not a myth. It's a clay tablet. Multiple copies exist across different museums. The British Museum has one, the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford has another, and they all say the same thing. Before the Great Flood, kings ruled for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once again, and the dynasties became shorter, more human. Etana appears in the post-flood section as the 13th king of the first dynasty of Kish. The king list describes him with one line that separates him from every other ruler. Etana, the shepherd, who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign countries, became king and reigned 1,500 years. Ascended to heaven, not metaphorically. The Sumerian language is precise. The word used is elu, which means to go up physically, to rise, to ascend bodily. It's the same word used when describing climbing a ziggurat or lifting water from a well. But here's where it gets strange. Other tablets, other fragments found scattered across Iraq, Syria, and Turkey don't just mention his ascension. They describe his descent, his journey downward, into the earth. The Epic of Etana is not complete. Archaeologists have recovered maybe 60% of the original text. The gaps are maddening. But what survives is detailed enough to reconstruct his journey. The first fragments were discovered in 1890 by German archaeologist Robert Koldewey at the site of ancient Babylon. More pieces surfaced in 1902 at Assur. Then in 1914, additional tablets turned up at Susa in modern Iran. Each discovery added fragments to the puzzle, but the complete narrative remains elusive. The missing 40% could be buried under Baghdad, lost to looters, or deliberately destroyed by those who understood what it actually described. What we do have comes from three distinct versions: the Old Babylonian version from around 1800 BCE, the Middle Assyrian version from 1000 BCE, and the Standard Babylonian version from 700 BCE. They all tell the same story with remarkable consistency across 1,000 years of copying and translation. That consistency matters, because myths change, stories evolve, details shift with each retelling. But the Epic of Etana stays locked. The descriptions remain identical. The sequence of events never varies. That's not how mythology behaves. That's how documentation behaves. Etana's problem was simple. He had no heir. His wife couldn't conceive. In ancient Mesopotamia, a king without a son was a dynasty without a future. The city needed continuity. The gods demanded bloodline. Without an heir, Kish would fall into chaos the moment Etana died. He tried everything first. The text mentions offerings to Inanna, the goddess of fertility. Rituals performed by the high priests, prayers at every temple in Kish, consultations with diviners who read the future in sheep livers, and the flight patterns of birds. Nothing worked, so Etana did what any desperate king would do. He prayed, but not to the gods in the sky, to something else. The text describes Etana climbing to the top of a mountain and calling out to those who dwell beneath the foundation of the world. He asked for the plant of birth, a substance that would allow his wife to conceive, and something answered. The being that responds is described as the guardian of the gate, Not a god, not an angel, a guardian, someone whose job is to stand watch. The text says, "This being appeared in brilliance that burns without flame, and told Etana that what he seeks exists below. Not above, below the surface, below the roots of the mountains, in the place the Sumerians called the Abzu." Now, mainstream scholars translate Abzu as the abyss or the primordial waters. They treat it like a metaphor for chaos or the subconscious. But the Sumerian descriptions of the Abzu are not poetic, they're technical. The Abzu is described as a place, a physical location with structures, halls, and chambers. It has gates, it has guardians, it has rules. And according to multiple texts, it exists beneath the Earth's surface, accessible through specific entry points. The Abzu appears in dozens of Sumerian texts. The Enuma Elish describes it as the domain of Enki, constructed before the surface world was made habitable. The Atrahasis epic mentions it as the source of freshwater springs and the repository of secret knowledge. Temple hymns from Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer, describe priests descending into the Abzu through ritual gates to receive wisdom directly from Enki. But these aren't metaphors. The texts provide measurements, dimensions. The Eridu temple complex was built directly over what priests called the opening to the Abzu. Excavations at Eridu uncovered a shaft descending over 60 feet into the water table. But the shaft didn't stop at water. It continued down into bedrock, cut with precision that Bronze Age tools shouldn't have been capable of achieving. Where does that shaft lead? Nobody knows. The Iraqi government sealed it in 1985. No explanation given. Etana was told that one of these entry points was inside the mountain he stood on. The guardian instructed him to return at dawn, to bring no weapons, no servants, and to speak to no one about where he was going. And if he followed these rules, he would be taken down. The text says, Etana returned the next morning. The guardian was waiting, and the ground opened, not a cave, not a crack in the rock. The text is specific. The stone folded like cloth, and the way beneath was revealed. Etana descended. The epic describes the first part of his journey in fragments: stairs that glowed with their own light, air that tasted sharp like copper, a passage that stretched downward for what felt like hours, and at the bottom, a gate. The gate is described in detail. 2 pillars carved from a single black stone. No seams, no tool marks. Between the pillars, a barrier that shimmered like water but made no sound. Etana reached out to touch it, and his hand passed through without resistance. On the other side was the first hall. The Epic of Etana describes this hall with precision that doesn't match Bronze Age mythology. Eyes that didn't blink. This detail appears 3 times in the surviving fragments, always phrased the same way. Their eyes remained open as the eyes of fish. Not poetic language. An observation, a detail that stuck with Etana enough to repeat it. The text says they wore garments that clung without seam and carried objects that hummed. These objects are described elsewhere in the epic. Rods that emitted light without fire, tablets that displayed moving images, devices that allowed them to speak across great distances without raising their voices. Bronze Age fantasy or documentation of technology Etana had no framework to understand? When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas, the Aztecs described their ships as floating mountains, their horses as giant deer, their firearms as thunder sticks. They used the vocabulary they had to describe things they'd never seen before. Etana did the same. He described advanced technology using Bronze Age language. And for 4,000 years, we've dismissed it as primitive mythology. These beings didn't speak, not with their mouths. Etana describes their communication as words that form in the mind without sound. They told him he was expected, that his request had been heard before he even made it, and that what he sought would be given, but only after he completed the journey. The journey was not negotiable. To receive the plant of birth, Etana had to walk the entire path. 40 days, that number appears repeatedly in the fragments. 40 days beneath the earth, 40 days inside to Abzu. Why 40? That number shows up everywhere in ancient texts. Noah's flood lasted 40 days. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. Jesus fasted for 40 days in the desert. The Israelites wandered for 40 years. Buddha meditated under the Bodhi tree for 40 days before achieving enlightenment. Muhammad was 40 years old when he received his first revelation. It's too consistent to be coincidence, too precise to be symbolic. Some researchers believe 40 represents a cycle, a period of transformation, a span of time necessary for something fundamental to change. Not metaphorically, literally. That prolonged exposure to whatever environment exists inside the Earth requires exactly 40 days for the human body to adapt, to absorb, to alter. Modern biology supports this idea. The human body replaces its entire stock of red blood cells every 40 to 120 days. Skin cells regenerate completely in about 40 days. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, shows measurable changes after 40 days of consistent stimulus. 40 days is how long it takes for the human body to fundamentally change at a cellular level. The ancients knew this. They didn't have microscopes or cellular biology, but they knew because they'd observed it. Because someone had gone through the process and documented the timeline. Etana's journey through the Abzu is described in stages, each stage deeper than the last, each one stranger. In the second hall, the beings showed him what they called the Tablet of Destinies, not a clay tablet. The text describes it as a surface of flowing light where forms appear and fade. Etana watched as images moved across this surface, cities rising and falling, floods consuming entire lands, stars changing position in the sky. He was being shown the past and the future. The beings told him that time in the Abzu moves differently, that what happens above is already known below, that the surface world is watched, recorded, and occasionally adjusted. That word appears in the text. The Sumerian term is shotakulu, which means to make level, to balance, to correct. Etana asked what they were correcting. The beings showed him more images. Humans fighting each other with primitive weapons, crops failing, cities burning, and then the same scenes, but different. Humans working together, abundant harvests, cities thriving. The beings told him that humanity's path splits at certain moments, that these moments are fragile, and that those who dwell in the Abzu ensure the correct path is taken. But who gave them that authority? The fragments don't answer that question directly, but they hint. The beings refer to themselves as the Watchers who were placed, not born, not evolved, placed by something older, something the text calls the first intelligence. Etana's journey continued deeper. The third hall was different, smaller, the light dimmed, the walls were covered in symbols that moved when he looked at them directly. He tried to read them, but the beings told him not to. They said the symbols were not for surface dwellers, that to understand them fully would break his mind. This detail is important, because it suggests that whatever knowledge exists in the Abzu is not meant for everyone. That access is controlled. That even a king, even someone invited down, has limits. In the fourth hall, Etana saw the plant of birth. It grew in a chamber where the light was green and pulsing. The text describes it as a stem with leaves that shimmer like fish scales, roots that drink from stone. But when Etana reached for it, the beings stopped him. They told him he had to continue, that taking the plant now would render it useless, that it had to be prepared. The preparation involved the fifth hall, and this is where the text becomes almost incomprehensible. The fifth hall contained what the beings called the waters that are not water. Etana was told to submerge himself. The text says he hesitated. The substance didn't look like water. It didn't move like water. It glowed with a pale blue light and seemed to hum. But he stepped in, and the epic describes what happened next in fragments that scholars still argue over. The waters entered him, not through his mouth, through his skin. He felt them inside his chest, his head, his bones. He tried to scream, but had no breath. He tried to climb out, but had no strength. And then the waters spoke. The waters spoke, not the beings, the substance itself. It told him things, showed him things. The text breaks apart here, but the pieces that survive mention the first war, the breaking of the sky, and the reason for the watch. When Etana emerged, the beings told him he was ready, that the waters had cleansed him of the surface poison. What poison? The text doesn't say, but the implication is that living on the surface, breathing surface air, eating surface food, introduces something into the body that must be purged before deeper knowledge can be absorbed. How long was Etana in the fifth hall? The text says a time between times. Days? Hours? The Sumerian language has a specific word for this concept, umu ina ume, days within days, time that doesn't count the same way. After the fifth hall came the sixth, and this is where the epic of Etana shifts from strange to impossible. The sixth hall was not a hall, it was a vista. The text describes Etana stepping through a doorway and finding himself standing on a platform overlooking a space so vast he couldn't see the edges. Below him, structures, buildings, not primitive mud brick ziggurats. The text uses words like towers that touch the roof of the world and bridges of light spanning emptiness. The platform where Etana stood was carved from a single piece of stone, no joints, no seams, polished to a mirror finish, but somehow providing traction underfoot. When he looked over the edge, he saw the city stretched out below him for what seemed like miles. The buildings didn't sit on the ground, they floated. The text is explicit about this. Structures suspended in the air without pillars, without ropes, held by invisible hands. Etana watched beings moving between these floating structures on bridges made of light. The text says the bridges appeared when someone approached and disappeared after they crossed. And in the distance, movement. Hundreds of beings, maybe thousands, working, building, moving objects that floated without support. The beings told Etana he was looking at the city that predates the surface, a city inside the earth, older than Sumerian civilization, older than the flood. How big was this city? The text provides a reference point. Etana asked how long it would take to walk from one end to the other. The beings told him 40 days of walking without rest. If we assume a walking speed of 3 miles per hour and account for without rest, meaning continuous movement, that's roughly 2,900 miles. The distance from New York to Los Angeles, a city nearly 3,000 miles across, inside the Earth, built by beings who mastered gravity, light manipulation, and architectural engineering, that makes our modern skyscrapers look like children's blocks. Mainstream archaeology tells us that human civilization began around 10,000 BCE with the advent of agriculture, that before that we were hunter-gatherers, small tribes, no cities, no technology, but the Sumerian texts don't agree. They describe civilizations before the flood that had technology beyond what we possess today. Flying machines, weapons that leveled mountains, knowledge of genetics, astronomy, and mathematics that wouldn't be rediscovered for thousands of years. And according to the Epic of Etana, that civilization didn't disappear. It went underground. The beings explained to Etana that the flood was not a natural disaster. It was a reset, a deliberate purging of the surface world. And those who knew it was coming retreated into the Abzu. They sealed the gates. They waited. And when the waters receded, they emerged briefly to teach the survivors the basics: agriculture, writing, astronomy, kingship. But they didn't stay. They returned below because the surface was no longer safe for them. Why not? The fragments don't explain, but they mention the burning air and the poison that falls from the sky. Solar radiation? Something changed in Earth's atmosphere or magnetic field that made prolonged surface exposure dangerous for these beings. So they adapted. They built cities inside the Earth where the environment could be controlled, where the light never changed, where the air stayed pure, and from there they watched the surface, guided it, corrected it when necessary. Etana asked the beings how they traveled between the surface and the Abzu. The text describes them showing him the pillars that connect, not metaphorical pillars, physical structures. The beings told him there were 7 entry points around the world, 7 gates, and each gate was guarded. Where are these gates? The text names one, Mount Mashu, the mountain at the edge of the world where the sun rises. Scholars place Mount Mashu somewhere in the Zagros Mountains between modern-day Iraq and Iran. But that entire region is now inaccessible due to conflict and political restrictions. Convenient. Other ancient texts mention similar entry points. The Egyptians spoke of the Duat, an underworld realm accessed through specific locations in the desert. The Greeks described the entrance to Hades at Cape Matapan. The Norse sagas place Niflheim beneath the roots of Yggdrasil. The Tibetans wrote about Agartha and Shambhala, hidden kingdoms inside the earth. Every culture, every continent, the same story, beings living underground, advanced knowledge hidden below, gates that only open for the chosen. Etana's journey through the Abzu lasted the full 40 days. The text describes additional halls, additional revelations, but the fragments are too damaged to reconstruct the full sequence. What survives are glimpses. He saw chambers filled with seeds, thousands of varieties, plants that no longer grow on the surface. The beings told him these were the living library, preserved in case the surface needed to be replanted. He saw rooms filled with objects he couldn't identify. The text describes tools that sing, stones that think, and boxes that hold light. He saw what the beings called the map of the world below, a network of tunnels connecting the cities of the Abzu, stretching beneath oceans, crossing under continents. The beings told him the tunnel system was older than the current surface geography, that it was built when the continents were arranged differently. This matches exactly with the theory of plate tectonics, which wasn't understood until the 1960s. How did Bronze Age Sumerians know the continents used to be in different positions? On the 40th day, the beings gave Etana the plant of birth. The text describes it as a root wrapped in cloth that does not rot. They told him to return to the surface, to grind the root into powder, to mix it with honey and milk, and to give it to his wife for 7 nights. But before he left, they gave him a warning. The beings told Etana that he must never speak of what he saw in the Abzu, not to his priests, not to his advisors, not even to his wife. If he did, the knowledge would be taken back, his memory would be smooth like wet clay. And yet, we have the text. We have the epic of Etana describing exactly what he saw. How? One theory is that Etana wrote it down years later, near the end of his life, knowing the beings couldn't stop him because he was about to die anyway. Another theory is that the beings allowed it, that they wanted the knowledge preserved but only in fragments, incomplete, deniable. A third theory is darker, that Etana did tell someone, and that person, or their descendants, were the ones who wrote it down, and that the smoothing of memory didn't happen to Etana. It happened to everyone who tried to take the text seriously afterward. Etana returned to the surface through the same gate he entered. The text says the journey up took only hours, though the journey down had taken days. The beings told him this was because he was now aligned with the path. When he emerged, the mountain was the same, the sky was the same, but Etana was not. The text describes him as changed in countenance. His skin reflected light differently. His eyes saw things others couldn't. And when he spoke, people felt compelled to listen, even when his words made no sense. He gave the plant to his wife. She conceived. Their son, Bali, became the next king of Kish. The dynasty continued, and Etana's name was added to the king list with that one impossible line: ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign countries. But here's the question nobody asks. If Etana went down, not up, why does the king list say he ascended to heaven? Because in Sumerian cosmology, the Abzu is not hell. It's not the underworld, it's the realm of Enki, the god of wisdom, creation, and freshwater, the place where knowledge originates. And in Sumerian thought, to descend into the Abzu is to ascend in consciousness. Heaven and the Abzu are the same place, just accessed from different directions. Modern researchers who take the Epic of Etana literally point to geological evidence. There are massive cave systems beneath the Zagros Mountains, unexplored, unmapped. Some of them stretch for hundreds of miles. Ground-penetrating radar has detected voids and chambers at depths that shouldn't be possible. In 2017, a team of Iranian geologists reported finding an entrance to a massive subterranean structure near Mount Damavand, the highest peak in the Middle East, and a location steeped in ancient Persian mythology. The Iranian government immediately classified the site. No further information was released. The Sumerian king list still exists. You can see it in the British Museum. And if you read it carefully, you'll notice something. Etana is not the only king described as ascending to heaven. There are others: Enmedarenki, Ziusudra, Utuabzu. All of them listed, all of them real historical figures according to Mesopotamian records. All of them described as leaving Earth and returning with knowledge. What if the Epic of Etana isn't mythology? What if it's a memoir, a first-hand account of contact with something we've been trained to dismiss? The mountain hasn't moved. The entry points haven't disappeared. They've just been buried under millennia of sediment, conflict, and deliberate obscurity. Etana walked into the earth and came back. He documented what he saw. and someone made sure we'd never take it seriously. Until now. If this kind of forbidden history is what you're looking for, I've got a video on the Anunnaki genetic experiments the academic establishment refuses to discuss. It's on screen right now. Click it, and I'll see you there.